If you're 55 or older and you're still telling yourself you'll retire at 67 because that's just what everyone does, I need you to hear this. That number isn't a rule. It's a guess someone else made for you. I'm Tom Wynn. 8 years ago, I had $7,200 saved and no plan. I know what it feels like to think retirement is something that happens to other people. But here's what I found going through the actual math. There are 6 specific reasons why waiting until 67 can quietly cost you more than it saves you. Not opinions, numbers. And by the time I get to the last one, you'll understand why the people who could retire soonest are often the most afraid to do it. Reason number 1 has nothing to do with money at first. It's about time, the kind you can't earn back, no matter how good your portfolio looks. If you're already down this road with me, this is the kind of thing I go through every week. Might be worth sticking around for. Here's the assumption almost everyone makes without ever saying it out loud. I'll work until 67, and then I'll retire, on my terms, right on schedule. It sounds reasonable. It's also, for a huge number of people, not what actually happens. Look at the research on retirement timing, and a pattern shows up again and again. Close to half of retirees leave the workforce earlier than they had planned, not because they hit their number early, not because they decided one Tuesday that they were done, because of a layoff, a health scare, a parent who suddenly needed care, a body that stopped cooperating with the plan. Half. Think about that for a second. Flip a coin in your head right now. Heads, you get to choose exactly when you walk away. Tails, something else decides for you, on its own timeline, not yours. That's roughly where the odds sit for the average American approaching retirement. Not a small footnote. Not a rare exception you read about and assume won't apply to you. A coin flip. And here's what makes it worse. The people this catches off guard aren't always the ones who weren't paying attention. Often it's the ones who did everything right, saved consistently, avoided debt, showed up to work for 30 years without complaint. They assumed responsibility would be enough to guarantee control over the timing. It isn't. It never was. That means the "I'll just work a few more years" strategy, the one so many people are quietly leaning on right now, isn't actually a plan. It's a bet. And the odds are closer to a coin flip than most people would like to admit. I didn't know that number when I was 47, sitting with $7,200 and a spreadsheet I didn't know how to build yet. I assumed I had all the time in the world to fix things. Assumed the choice would always be mine. It might be. For you, it might not. Here's the part that surprised me most when I actually sat with this. The years people assume are extra, the ones tacked onto the end of a career just in case, aren't neutral. They're not free storage space where nothing happens until you're ready to use them. They're the years your body is quietly negotiating a different deal with you. The years your energy for anything other than work starts to shrink, whether or not your calendar agrees. So reason number 1 isn't really about retiring early. It's about retiring while the choice is still actually yours to make, not one that gets made for you by circumstances you didn't choose and can't control. I want to be clear about something here because I know how this can sound. This isn't me telling you to quit your job tomorrow. Some people love their work. Some people need every one of those extra years, financially, and there's no shame in that. This isn't about everyone rushing for the exit. It's about knowing the real odds before you build your whole plan around later. Because a plan that only works if nothing unexpected happens for the next 10 or 15 years isn't really a plan. It's a hope with a spreadsheet attached to it. I've heard from people through the comments here and through the newsletter who found this out the hard way. A man in his early 60s, laid off after 26 years at the same company. He'd planned to work until 66. He wasn't given a vote. The severance ran out faster than the job search did. He's fine now. Better than fine, actually. But something he told me has stuck with me since. He said he'd spent 5 years planning for a retirement he chose, and never once planned for the one that got handed to him instead. I think about the version of me at 47 a lot. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't careless. He just believed the calendar would ask his permission before anything changed. It didn't ask. It just changed. That's the quiet trap in "I'll retire at 67. It sounds like a decision. Most of the time, it's actually a hope wearing a decision's clothes. And that idea, that the clock might not be as patient as your plan assumes, connects directly to reason number 2. Because it turns out there's a second, even more overlooked cost to waiting, one that shows up not in your bank account, but in your body. And the research on that one is a lot more specific than most people realize. Reason number 2 showed up in my inbox, not in a textbook. A guy named Ed sent it to me, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. Ed was 61 when he wrote to me. A retired firefighter, 31 years on the job. The kind of guy who could still out-hike men half his age. His plan was simple. Work 2 more years for the pension bump, retire at 63, spend the next 20 years doing everything the job never let him do. Hiking the Appalachian Trail in sections, learning to sail, actually using his knees for something other than standing on a ladder. He made it to 63. He retired exactly on schedule. His knees didn't get the memo. 2 more years of standing shifts finished off what 3 decades of firefighting had already started. By the time Ed's pension kicked in, so did the arthritis. Not enough to stop him completely, but enough to turn hike the Appalachian Trail into walk around the block on a good day. He didn't lose his retirement. He lost the version of it he'd spent 2 extra years working toward. What gets me about Ed's story isn't that something went wrong. It's that nothing went wrong exactly. No accident. No single bad day. Just ordinary wear, doing what ordinary wear does when you give it 2 more years of standing shifts to work with. The system worked exactly the way it always does. Ed just assumed his body was running on a different clock than his pension. It wasn't. It never is. Has your own timeline shifted because of your health or someone close to you? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and I'm not asking to be polite. Here's the research behind what happened to Ed, and it's more specific than most people realize. There's a number researchers use called healthspan, not how long you live, but how long you live without a major chronic limitation slowing you down. In the U.S., healthspan, on average, runs out in the mid-60s. Life expectancy keeps going into the high 70s and beyond. Sit with that gap for a second. Roughly a decade on average where you're alive, but not fully able to do the things retirement is supposed to be for. Nobody puts that number on a retirement calculator. The calculators ask how much you'll need at 67. They never ask what 67 will actually feel like in your knees, your back, your energy for a full day on your feet. And it's not evenly distributed either. Physical jobs eat into that health span faster. The standing, the lifting, the shift work. But desk jobs aren't exempt. Sitting has its own bill, and it comes due just as quietly. Different wear. Same clock. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you because I wish someone had told me at 47, when I was so focused on the dollar amount that I never once asked myself what shape I'd be in to actually use it. Money buys options. It doesn't buy back cartilage. It doesn't buy back a decade of mornings where getting out of bed used to be automatic. This is the part of the retirement conversation nobody wants to have, because it isn't hopeful in the usual way. It's not save more and everything works out. It's the years you're banking on for later are not guaranteed to arrive intact. Ed told me something else near the end of his message that I think about more than almost anything else I've heard from someone watching this channel. He said if he could go back, he wouldn't have worked those 2 extra years for the pension bump. He'd have taken the smaller number and kept his knees. That's not a math problem. That's a trade nobody warns you you're making. I keep a version of Ed's message saved. Not because it's the saddest thing anyone's ever told me. It's not even close. I keep it because it's so ordinary. He didn't do anything wrong. He did what the advice tells everyone to do. Work a little longer. Pad the number. Play it safe. Playing it safe isn't always the safe move. Sometimes it's just the slower one. Ed's doing okay now, by the way. He adjusted. Found a version of retirement that fits the needs he actually has instead of the ones he planned around. But he'll tell you himself, given the choice again, he'd have taken less money and more mobility. Every time, and it leads straight into reason number 3, because it turns out the math itself, the part everyone assumes gets safer the longer you wait, can actually work against you too. Not because the market is unpredictable, because of exactly when it decides to be. Reason number 3 is the one that surprised me the most, because it goes against almost everything the just wait a little longer crowd tells you. Here's the assumption baked into, I'll work 5 more years to build a bigger cushion. More years working automatically means more safety, more time in the market, more room to recover if anything goes wrong. I don't know when the next downturn is coming, neither does anyone telling you they do. Anyone who says otherwise is selling something. What I do know is this: the moment you retire matters more than how many extra years you work to get there. Researchers call it sequence of returns risk, and once you see it laid out, you can't unsee it. Stick with me for one more minute here, because this is the part most retirement advice skips entirely. Picture 2 people, same amount saved, same average return over 25 years of retirement, let's say 7% a year on average, identical numbers on paper. The only difference, the order the returns show up in. Retiree 1 gets hit with a rough market in the first few years of retirement, a real downturn right out of the gate. Retiree 2 gets that same downturn, but it lands in year 24 instead of year 1. Same average return, same withdrawals. Wildly different outcomes. Retiree 1 pulling money out while the portfolio is already down can run out of money years earlier than retiree 2, sometimes a full decade earlier, depending on how the numbers land. Retiree 2 barely feels it, because by the time the downturn hits, the portfolio's already grown enough to absorb it. Same average, same discipline, same everything except timing. And timing isn't something you can plan your way around by simply working longer. That's the part that gets missed. Working 5 extra years doesn't protect you from a bad sequence. It just moves you to a different roll of the dice. You could work those 5 extra years, retire right into a downturn anyway, and end up worse off than if you'd retired on your original timeline and gotten lucky with the order. There's no version of wait longer that guarantees a safer sequence. There's only a different sequence. Think about what that actually means for someone sitting where you might be sitting right now, 58, 60, 62, weighing whether one more year at the desk buys you real safety or just a new, unknown roll of the dice. It's not nothing, but it's not the guarantee it's marketed as either. I'll admit something here. For a long time, I thought more time working was always the safer move. Simple math, more saved, less time to draw it down. What could go wrong? I never accounted for order. I never accounted for the fact that the market doesn't care how responsible you've been or how many extra years you put in out of caution. It doesn't hand out safety for good behavior. It just does whatever it does, whenever it does it. So if delaying retirement isn't the guaranteed safety net people assume it is, if it's just a different set of odds, not better odds, that changes the entire conversation about waiting until you feel ready. Because feeling ready and being protected from bad timing turn out to be 2 completely different things. Ready is a feeling. Protected is a number. They're not the same, and mixing them up is how good, careful people end up making decisions based on the wrong evidence. And that brings us to reason number 4. Because there's one thing you actually can control in all of this, something that has nothing to do with the market and everything to do with a number most people never bother to calculate for themselves. Reason number 4 is the one that gets sold to almost everyone the same way, like it's universal advice that applies to every single person watching. It isn't. You've probably heard some version of this. Wait until 70 to claim Social Security. Your benefit grows about 8% a year for every year you delay. It's basically free money. That's true, as far as it goes. What almost nobody tells you in that same breath is the other half of the math, the part that actually determines whether waiting was the right call or not. It's called the break-even age, the age you'd need to live to for all those years of delayed smaller checks to actually catch up to and pass what you'd have collected by claiming earlier. For most people weighing 62 against 70, that break-even age lands somewhere around 80, sometimes into the early 80s, depending on your exact numbers. Let's make it concrete. Say your benefit at 62 comes out to roughly $1,800 a month. Wait until 70, and that same benefit could grow to somewhere around $3,200 a month, a real meaningful jump. But claim at 62, and you're already collecting for 8 extra years before the bigger check version even starts. Those 8 years of smaller checks add up to real money sitting in your account, growing, compounding, doing something, while the delayed version sits at 0. It takes a long time for the bigger monthly number to out-earn those 8 Head Start years. That's the break-even age, and it's later than almost anyone assumes going in. So the real question isn't, should I wait for the bigger check? The real question is, how confident am I that I'll live past 80 comfortably in good enough health to actually enjoy the money once it arrives? Nobody can answer that with certainty. Not you, not me. Not the advisor who's telling you to wait as if it's a rule instead of a bet on your own lifespan. And here's what almost never gets said out loud. A meaningful share of Americans don't make it past that break-even point. For some groups, men in physically demanding careers, in particular, average life expectancy sits close enough to that break-even age that wait for the bigger check stops being obviously correct and starts being a genuine coin toss. I'm not telling you to claim early. I'm not telling you to wait either. I'm telling you that just wait until 70 isn't advice. It's a guess dressed up as a rule, and it's being handed to millions of people as if it fits everyone equally. It doesn't. Here's what it actually depends on. Your health right now, honestly assessed, not how you feel today, but your family history, your own track record. Whether you have a spouse whose survivor benefit depends partly on your claiming decision, which changes the math entirely. Whether you need the income now to actually live on versus delaying because a spreadsheet told you to. That spousal piece trips up more people than almost anything else in this conversation. If you're the higher earner in a marriage, your claiming age doesn't just set your own check. It can set the floor for what your spouse receives as a survivor benefit for the rest of their life after you're gone. Delay a few years on a rule of thumb, and you might be making a decision on their behalf that they never got a real vote in. Those are 4 different questions, and wait until 70 pretends they all have the same answer. I claimed exactly 0 opinions on this for years because I didn't understand it well enough to have one. I just repeated what I'd heard. Wait if you can. Bigger check. Better deal. It wasn't until I actually ran my own numbers, my own health history, my own family's actuarial luck, that I realized the obvious answer wasn't obvious at all. It was one option among several dressed up as the only responsible choice. If retiring sooner means claiming earlier, and claiming earlier fits your actual health and family history better than some generic rule of thumb, that's not giving up on free money. That's doing the math for your own life instead of borrowing someone else's average. I think that's really what bothers me about just wait until 70 as a blanket rule. It's not wrong exactly, it's just lazy. It takes a decision that should be built from your specific health, your specific marriage, your specific need for income, and flattens it into a single number that's supposed to work for 300 million different lives. It doesn't. It can't. No single age can, and averages are exactly the problem with reason number 5 too. Because there's a decision hiding in the years right around retirement that most people never even know exists. One that can cost tens of thousands of dollars in taxes, quietly, with no warning label attached. It's not about how much you save, it's about the order you spend it in and the window you have to fix it before it closes for good. Reason number 5 is the one I get the most messages about, because almost nobody hears about it until it's already too late to use it. But before I show you what this can actually cost you, stick with me through the mechanics, because the payoff here is bigger than anything we've covered so far. Most of your retirement savings, the traditional 401k, the traditional IRA, hasn't actually been taxed yet. You got a deduction putting the money in. The IRS is still owed its cut. It's just waiting patiently for you to pull the money out. Here's the part almost nobody plans around. There's a stretch of years, usually right after you stop working and before Social Security and required withdrawals kick in, where your taxable income can drop to almost nothing. No paycheck, no forced distributions yet, just whatever you choose to pull out. That gap is a window. And inside that window, you can convert chunks of your traditional retirement money into a Roth IRA, paying tax on it now, at whatever low bracket you're sitting in during those quiet years, instead of later when required withdrawals force larger amounts out at a higher rate. Do it right, and you can move a meaningful piece of your savings from will be taxed later at an unknown, possibly higher rate, to already taxed, growing completely tax-free forever. Do it well over several years, and the difference can run into the tens of thousands of dollars over a full retirement, sometimes more depending on how much you're working with. Here's the catch. That window only exists if there's a real gap between when you stop working and when Social Security and required withdrawals begin. Work until 67, and for a lot of people that gap shrinks down to almost nothing. Social Security starts, income stays high. The low-tax years where conversions actually make sense never show up, or show up so briefly there's barely time to use them. Retire earlier, even by a few years, and that gap opens wide. Room to convert, room to control your own tax bracket instead of having it dictated to you by whatever the IRS decides required withdrawals should look like at 73. Think about a couple who retires at 62. They've got roughly a decade before required withdrawals start pulling money out on the government schedule instead of theirs. 10 years of quiet, low-income years where they can convert a chunk of savings every single year, paying tax at a modest bracket instead of getting pushed into a much higher one once those required withdrawals finally kick in and stack on top of Social Security. Say they convert $40,000 a year for those 10 years. At a modest bracket that's real tax paid but manageable, nothing like what the same $400,000 would trigger if it all got dumped out at once later, forced by required withdrawal rules, on top of Social Security income pushing them into a much higher bracket for the rest of their lives. Compare that to someone working until 67 or later. Their window might be 3 or 4 years, if that. Barely enough time to make a dent. Same amount saved. Wildly different tax bill over the following 2 or 3 decades. Not because one person was smarter with their investments, because one of them had years to work with and the other didn't. Nobody puts a warning label on this. Your 401k provider doesn't send an email that says, by the way, working 3 more years just cost you your best shot at controlling your future tax bracket. It's not something anyone's incentivized to tell you. I didn't know about this window until I was already deep into my 50s, closer to closing it than opening it. I'm not going to pretend I've maximized it the way someone who retired at 55 with a decade of runway could. That's part of the trade I made, working longer than I might have otherwise needed to. Some of that was necessary. I started at 47 with $7,200 and no plan. I needed the extra years, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise. But I'll also tell you this. Nobody ever once mentioned this window to me while I still had years of it left to use. Not a single advisor, not a single article. I found out about it by accident, reading something at 1 a.m. that had nothing to do with what I was actually looking for. That's the part that bothers me most. Not that the window closes. Windows close. That's what windows do. It's that almost nobody gets told it exists in time to actually use it. But I know it now, and I'd rather you know it while the window's still wide open instead of finding out about it the way I did, mostly closed with regret attached. And that brings us to the last one. The reason that's harder to put a number on than any of the other 5, but once you see it clearly, you'll understand exactly why the people who could retire soonest are so often the ones most afraid to actually do it. Reason number 6 is the one that actually explains the question I asked you back at the start of this video. Why the people who could retire soonest are so often the ones most afraid to do it. It's not about the money. Not really. By the time someone's actually in a position to retire, the number's there, the accounts are funded, the math checks out, money stops being the obstacle. Something else takes over. Identity does. Ask most people over 50 who they are, and somewhere in the first sentence you'll hear their job, not as a footnote, as the answer. 22 years in sales, 31 years fighting fires. A career that didn't just pay the bills, it built the entire scaffolding of who they understood themselves to be. Retirement doesn't just remove a paycheck, it removes the scaffolding. There's a term for what happens next, one that shows up constantly in retirement planning circles. One more year syndrome. People who are completely, verifiably ready to retire, the accounts funded, the withdrawal rate sound, every box checked, who keep pushing the date back anyway. One more year, then another. There's a term for what happens next, one that shows up constantly in retirement planning circles. One more year syndrome. People who are completely, verifiably ready to retire, the accounts funded, the withdrawal rate sound, every box checked, who keep pushing the date back anyway. One more year, then another. It's not always about greed or fear of a market downturn or any of the reasons people assume. Sometimes it's just easier to say, I need one more year than to say, I don't know what I'm walking into, and that terrifies me more than staying does. On paper, it looks like caution. In practice, ask most of them honestly, and a different reason surfaces. They're not staying for the money. They're staying because they don't know who they are without the badge, the title, the Monday morning routine that structured their identity for 3 decades. Financial advisors see this constantly, clients who are more than ready by every metric, who keep finding new reasons to delay. Not because the spreadsheet says wait, because retiring means confronting a question they've spent 30 years avoiding. Who am I when nobody's paying me to show up? You see it in small ways before it ever gets said out loud. The client who suddenly wants to run the numbers one more time for the 4th year in a row, even though the numbers haven't meaningfully changed. The one who finds a new certification to chase, a new project at work that just needs to get finished first. The finish line keeps moving, not because the math demands it, but because moving it is easier than crossing it. That's the twist hiding underneath everything we've covered today. The 5 reasons before this one are about what waiting costs you: money, mobility, tax efficiency, control. This one is different. This one is about what waiting protects you from having to face. Being financially ready to retire doesn't just open a door, it forces a question through that door, whether you're ready for it or not. And the people who aren't ready for the identity question yet will find an infinite supply of financial reasons to keep the door closed a little longer. I understand this one better than any of the other 5 because I lived a version of it. Not one more year syndrome exactly. I didn't have the luxury of being ready early. But I recognize the shape of it. The comfort in staying inside a role you already know how to play, even an uncomfortable one, rather than stepping into a version of your life with no script yet written. 22 years of being the sales guy. Good at it, known for it. And when that ended, not entirely on my own terms, if I'm honest, the hardest part wasn't the missing paycheck. It was the missing answer to a question I hadn't realized I'd never had to ask before. Without that title, who exactly was I? I didn't have an elegant answer at 47. I'm not sure I have a fully elegant one now at 55. But I stopped treating it as a problem to solve before moving forward and started treating it as a question that gets answered by living, not by thinking harder about it in advance. Here's what almost nobody says about that fear out loud. It doesn't go away by working longer. It just gets postponed. The identity question doesn't have an expiration date attached to your paycheck. Whether you retire at 58 or 68, at some point you stop being defined by the job. The only real choice is whether you build the answer to, who am I without it, while you still have the health and the years to actually enjoy building it, or whether you wait until the choice gets made for you, and you're left answering that question with less time and less body to work with. That's not a financial risk. It's the deepest version of every risk we've talked about today, all pointed at the same target. The years you're assuming will still be there when you're finally ready. They might be, they might not. And that brings us to the part of this where all 6 of these reasons actually come together, where the math, the body, the fear, and the number all meet in the same place. Because there's one more thing I haven't told you yet, about what happened after Ed sent me that message. Here's the last thing about Ed's message that I haven't told you yet. It wasn't the last one he sent me. A few months later, a second message showed up. Shorter, different tone entirely. He'd started something new. Nothing dramatic, no Appalachian Trail, no sailing lessons, nothing that would have made a good highlight reel for anyone watching from the outside. He'd started leading short hikes twice a week for a handful of other retired guys from the department. 2 miles, sometimes 3. Flat ground, plenty of stops. The kind of hike his 61-year-old self would have called barely worth lacing up boots for. He told me how it started, almost by accident, the way most of the good things seem to. A former colleague from the department, going through his own rough stretch after retiring, mentioned he'd put on weight, stopped leaving the house much. Ed suggested a walk, just around the neighborhood, nothing formal. The guy showed up, then he brought someone else the next week. 6 weeks in, it had a name. A meeting time texted out every Sunday night. A group text that filled up faster than Ed expected. Ed hadn't planned any of it. He just said yes to one walk on a day he could have easily said no. He said it was the first thing since retiring that felt like it was actually his, not the pension, not the free time he'd spent the first few months not knowing what to do with, sitting in a recliner that used to feel like a reward and started to feel like a waiting room. This. 2 miles, twice a week, with guys who understood exactly why he walked a little slower than he used to, and never once made him explain it. He didn't get his knees back. He didn't get the version of retirement he'd spent 2 extra years working toward. What he got instead was smaller and somehow more solid, a version of purpose that fit the life he actually had, instead of the one he'd planned for on paper. That's it. That's the whole thing this video has actually been circling since the first minute. Every reason on this list, the coin flip on involuntary retirement, the health span gap, the sequence of returns, the Social Security break-even, the closing Roth window, the identity underneath all of it, points at the same target. Not retire the second you can. Not some grand promise that everything gets easier the moment you stop working. Just this. The years you're counting on to use everything you've built might not show up the way you're picturing them, not because you did anything wrong, because that's what years do. They don't wait for your convenience, and they don't ask your permission before they change shape on you. I think about how differently Ed's second message could have read. He could have written to tell me the knees never got better. That retirement turned out smaller and sadder than the brochure version he'd pictured for 2 extra years of standing shifts. That would have been an honest message, too. It just wasn't the one he sent. The difference wasn't the diagnosis. The diagnosis was fixed the moment it happened. No version of the story undoes that. The difference was what he did with the years that were still fully his, once he stopped waiting for them to look the way he'd originally planned. I think that's the honest version of everything we've walked through today. Not a warning to scare you into quitting your job tomorrow. Not a countdown clock designed to make you panic. Just an honest look at what later actually costs, in odds, in cartilage, in tax brackets, in identity, measured against what later is usually sold as free, safe, and infinitely available. It isn't infinite. It never was. It just felt that way because nobody ever showed you the actual math sitting underneath the feeling. I don't know what your version of Ed's second message looks like. I don't know if it's a shorter walk than you planned, a smaller number than you hoped for, a retirement that starts at 63 instead of 58. I don't know if your reason on this list is the coin flip, or the knees, or the tax window closing quietly in the background while nobody's watching. I do know it's easier to find out what it looks like from inside it than from out here, still waiting for the fear to go first. Ed didn't get the retirement he planned for. He got a smaller one, and he built something real inside it anyway, because he didn't wait for the fear to resolve itself before he started walking. That's the part nobody tells you about being ready. Ready doesn't feel like confidence. It rarely does. It feels like doing the thing anyway, at whatever pace your knees, your accounts, and your nerve can actually manage, instead of waiting for a version of certainty that was never going to arrive. I'm 55 now. 8 years into this, and I still don't have every answer. I still check the numbers more often than I probably need to. Some nights the old panic from that $7,200 apartment shows back up uninvited, even now, even with a plan that works. I used to think the goal was to reach a point where that panic disappeared entirely. Some future version of myself, fully arrived, fully certain, checking his accounts once a year out of habit instead of anxiety. I don't think that version exists. Not for me, not for most of the people who write into this channel every week. What exists instead is a quieter relationship with the fear. It still shows up, it just doesn't get the final vote anymore. I've stopped waiting for that feeling to fully go away before trusting the math underneath it. That's not the same as being fearless. It's closer to what I saw in Ed, doing the 2-mile walk anyway, on the knees you actually have, instead of holding out for the trail you originally planned. I share this kind of thing every week here, the parts of this that don't fit neatly into a headline, the math nobody puts a warning label on. If any of this landed, sticking around for the next one is the easiest way to make sure you don't miss it. If you're sitting there right now wondering whether you're actually one of the people who's ready, even if the fear hasn't caught up with the math yet, I put together 6 questions that cut straight through that. It's the next video I'd point you to. Watch that one next. 67 was never a promise. It was just a guess someone else made for you a long time ago. Yours doesn't have to be.